Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks. Today, we're going to have a look at the attackers, the offensive side, the Imperial Guard 88th Krieg Siege Army. And unlike the Vraksian defenders, whom we don't really know much solid about, the Imperial Guard is a rather bureaucratic army, and we have a pretty damn good idea of the makeup of the 88th Siege Army. First and foremost, it was made up of 4 different types of formations: the Line Corps, the Assault Corps, the Bombardment Corps, and Independent Artillery Companies. These 4 different formations, all in all, made up 8 corps, starting with the 1st, 5th, 30th, and 34th Line Corps, the 8th and 11th Assault Corps, and the 19th and 21st Bombardment Corps. And finally, we have 14 independent artillery companies that could be attached to any of the previous formations to add a little bit of extra firepower. This leaves us with a general idea of the order of battle, but let's go into a little bit more detail, looking into the various types of formations, starting with the Line Corps. On Vraks, all 4 Line Corps were organized in the same manner. So as an example, we'll look at the 1st Krieg Line Corps. It consisted of the 3rd, the 5th, the 15th, and the 19th Krieg Siege Regiments. You might already have noticed the fact that these are specifically named Siege Regiments. They are not mechanized regiments, they are not infantry regiments, nor are they artillery regiments. This is because Krieg is one of very few planets within the Imperium that is trusted with the privilege of fielding combined arms formations. Just in case you are not aware, the overwhelming majority of Imperial Guard regiments, something along the lines of 99.9%, are made up of a single arm of the Imperial Guard, be it mechanized, tanks, super heavy, infantry, or artillery. The idea behind this is that several regiments will be combined so that they can utilize one another's strengths. For example, an infantry regiment cooperating with an artillery regiment, or an artillery regiment cooperating with a mechanized regiment. Once again, this allows the Imperial Guard overall to call upon the full power of combined arms tactics. However, it does not allow the individual regiment to call upon these tactics by themselves. This might at first seem counterintuitive, and in a way it is, since it leaves every single Imperial Guard regiment individually weaker, and that is precisely the point. You see, the Imperium has had a long problem with chaos, and certain regiments being somewhat untrustworthy. So this system was created to make sure that if any one Imperial Guard regiment was to turn to chaos or in some other way become corrupted, it could not utilize the full range of tactics that the other Imperial Guard regiments could call upon. The basic idea is that if an artillery regiment turns to chaos, it can easily be overrun by a mechanized and an artillery regiment, or if an infantry regiment falls to chaos, it can easily be overrun by a mechanized and a tank regiment, and so on and so on. It is a way of compartmentalizing the Imperial Guard and managing the risk that is always included when fighting against the vile arch-enemy, or any other insidious Xenos threat, for example. Krieg, however, is an exceedingly loyal world, and in its lengthy history, not a single Krieg regiment has ever fallen to chaos. Thusly, it is one of very few that is trusted with deploying combined arms regiments, and the siege regiments are just such a formation. They can also be deployed in sizes that are considerably greater than the average Imperial Guard regiment, as was the case on Vraks. Now, just the general Imperial Guard regiment can already vary quite considerably in size, depending on the homeworld in question, depending on the type of regiment, depending upon the homeworld's standing within the Imperium, depending upon the task of which it is raised to deal with, etc., etc. It could be anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000 men. However, in the case of the regiments deployed to Vraks, they were massively engorged. with each individual regiment consisting of somewhere between 100,000 to 125,000 men. The massive size of these regiments were due to their specialized nature. The Krieg way of waging war is brutal, cold and mathematic. It utilizes massed bombardments, human wave tactics, and sheer grinding attrition to overwhelm and crush the enemy. And on Vraks, said enemy could easily number in the millions, and they were all sat in extensive field fortifications designed to resist just such a siege that the Imperium was now forced to commit to. The bloated size of the regiments were designed to be able to absorb the kind of attrition that would be needed to break Vraks, and also allow them to bring to bear enough guns to shatter the enemy's fortifications. Now, let's have a look at this massively bloated monstrosity, and how it might have been constructed, using the 3rd Krieg Siege Regiment as an example. First, of course, we have the regimental headquarters. This would be fully mechanized and equipped with various specialized communications devices to talk to the rest of the formations. Directly attached to the headquarters and also providing security for the headquarters would be various specialist formations, mostly grenadiers and engineers, along with a complement of regimental quartermasters and watchmasters, along with their respective staffs. The grenadier and engineer elements would be at roundabout company strength, which means circa 20,000 men, and would be equipped with mostly mechanized forms of transports, either light Centaur personnel carriers or chimeras. They would also be equipped with their own dedicated light artillery batteries. After this, the main fighting force of the regiment would be subdivided into 5 companies. 4 of these companies would be made up primarily of infantry, with 9 infantry platoons consisting of 2,500 men each, and an equally strong heavy weapons platoon. In the case of Vraks, the majority of these heavy weapons would be light artillery, like the heavy quad launcher or the mortar, along with a few heavy bolters, las cannons, and flamers for general support. These engorged platoons could be further divided into squads, sections, and fire teams, but with the sheer scale of the fighting taking place on Vraks, this was rarely practical. If anything, a lower-ranking officer might be in command of a section of, say, 100 men. He would then hand out individual objectives to sergeants, say capturing a specific bunker or capturing a trench line. The sergeant would then take as many men as he thought necessary for the task, and however many he was allowed for the task, and form them into an ad hoc formation, often referred to as a squad or a fire team, although these formations rarely consisted of the numbers that we would think of as a squad or a fire team, since attacking anything on Vraks was usually a fairly considerable undertaking. In the case of the specialists, like the grenadiers and engineers, however, things could be quite different. They frequently operated in smaller formations because they were trained to do so, and they also had access to far more competent communications officers and equipment in general to facilitate these smaller scale operations. And finally, we have the 5th Company. In the case of siege regiments, this would invariably be an artillery company, made up of a smaller number of heavy guns, bombards and earthshakers, but a considerable quantity of lighter artillery pieces used to directly support infantry assaults. The artillery company would also bring along considerable quantities of lighter, heavier weapons, things like heavy bolters, las cannons, and missile launchers. These would be assigned to various formations before an attack, and would also be used to secure the regiment's own trench lines against counterattacks. And now, before we sum it all up, let's look at the individual numbers. Each one of the infantry companies would be made up of 25,000 men. The 5th Company, the Heavy Company, would consist of some 540 heavy weapons of various types. These weapons would then be crewed, operated, emplaced, commanded, and supplied by a total of 4,000 men. When we subsequently add in the numbers for the various specialists, the grenadiers, engineers, quartermasters, watchmasters, and of course the command staff, we end up at around about 125,000 men, give or take a few hundred. So now that we know the size of a line corps, let's have a look at the main thrust, the spear tip of the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, the assault corps, of which we have two, the 8th and the 11th. And unlike the line corps, we here have two formations of slightly different size. The general size of the regiments contained within are more or less the same, but you can see here that the 8th was marginally larger than the 11th, consisting of the 7th, the 11th, and the 14th Tank Regiment, along with the 179th Siege Regiment and the 231st Artillery Regiment, whilst the 11th Assault Corps consisted of the 61st Tank Regiment, the 66th Tank Regiment, the 101st Siege Regiment, and the 497th Siege Artillery Regiment, giving it one less tank regiment than the 8th. Of course, we've already looked at a siege regiment, and we'll be looking at an artillery regiment in a little bit, so here we'll primarily focus on the tank regiment. And we will take the 7th as our example. The name here is a little misleading, however, because whilst it does include a considerable quantity of tanks, the tanks themselves are not necessarily the defining feature of an assault corps. But we will get to that in a moment. First and foremost, the headquarters. Differing from an infantry regiment, the headquarters of a tank regiment is, of course, an armoured vehicle. The specific nature of the vehicle in question can vary considerably, and is usually up to the commander in question to decide. With this I mean it could be a demolisher, it could be a vanquisher, it could be a standard pattern Lehman Russ. It will be kitted out with considerably more powerful communications equipment than the rest of the tanks, and it could even be a lightly armoured vehicle, if the commander in question feels that he would be better suited to fulfill his duties by zipping around the battlefield in a salamander armoured personnel carrier with a ton of specialised communications equipment. It is fully within his power to do so. However, since Krieg officers rise up through the ranks, they will probably choose to stay in whatever vehicle they rose to this position commanding, be it a vanquisher, a battle tank, an annihilator, or anything else. This, along with the Krieg mentality of sacrificing oneself for the cause, leads Krieg tank officers to be quite aggressive, to put it mildly. No hiding in the back ranks issuing orders for these guys. Even if they are in a light salamander, they will quite literally be zipping along the front line, issuing orders to the various tank formations. If there is one thing you can be sure of, it is that any commander of a Krieg tank regiment is going to be a very hands-on commander. And due to this somewhat contentious nature, the officer in question is shadowed by 3 other armoured vehicles, forming a standard tank squadron within a regiment. These 3 tanks will be crewed by the most experienced and veteran members of the entire regiment, whose job it is to try and keep their commanding officer alive. As you can probably imagine, this is not the easiest of tasks. Considering the bellicose nature of the regimental officer, keeping him safe by simply tucking him away somewhere in the back lines is not going to happen. This leaves the bodyguard tanks with essentially 2 options. The first is to interpose themselves between the officer and any incoming fire, a often necessary maneuver, though preferably a maneuver to be avoided, as even within the Krieg cult of sacrifice, needless sacrifice is not looked upon in a particularly bright light. The preferred alternative, then, is B. To blast, brutalize, and break anything and everything that may pose a threat to their commander. A task that the Krieg bodyguard tanks have gotten very, very good at. The downside, of course, to being so very good at their jobs is that the commander in question might find this particularly emboldening and decide that since he has such excellent subordinates, it might be safe to go even closer to the front lines. In the immortal words of an unnamed Imperial Commissar, drive me closer, for I wish to hit them with my sword. But of course, even the bravest commander cannot be expected to smite all of the heretics by himself, and thus the regiment is divided into the usual 5 companies. The first company will be the main armoured strength of the regiment, consisting of something along the lines of 1,000 tanks, divided into squadrons of 4 vehicles, where one vehicle will be the command vehicle, and the other 3 being his squadron, his wingmates, if you wish. And the squadron can further be divided into 2 teams of 1 lead tank and 1 supporting tank. I also use the word tank here very deliberately, rather than, for example, Lehman Russ, because this tank company can be made up of a wide variety of different armoured vehicles. Vehicles of a particular type will be organised into squadrons consisting entirely of that type of vehicle. Then, depending on the type, the squadron will be given a designation and a specialised task. For example, a squadron made up of 5 destroyers will be formed into an anti-tank detachment, whilst a squadron of 4 Lehman Russ demolishers will be given infantry support tasks. Additionally, the vehicles in the company need not necessarily be battle tanks. There could, for example, be a squadron of light flamethrower tanks, like the Hellhounds, or a squadron of super heavies, like the Baneblades or Shadow Swords. Alternatively, and more usually, the super heavies would be formed into their very own companies, and be divided into their own squadrons within said company. This super heavy company would then be attached to the Assault Corps headquarters, or even, indeed, the Army headquarters, and then be assigned to the various formations as needed, since these incredibly powerful and valuable vehicles were rarely put at risk unless absolutely necessary. The idea, of course, between dividing the tank company into these various specialized squadrons is so that the various squadrons can support one another, and also so they can easily be doled out to the various infantry formations, since the primary purpose of the armor on Vraks would be to facilitate the creation of a breakthrough by aiding the infantry that are bashing their poor little heads in against the fortified front lines of Vraks, and then secondly, once a breakthrough has been created, to rush through the hole and exploit it. And as you can probably imagine, there is a considerable difference between bashing your head against a fortified line of bunkers and trenches and rushing across the open plains. Obviously then, you're going to be wanting very different tools. To break open the bunker lines, you'll want the fairly precise destroyers to blast out bunkers and to destroy tanks in their fortified positions. And of course the demolishers to simply just delete said bunkers and to collapse enemy trenches with their big fat HE shells. Whilst, when you're exploiting a breakthrough, you might want something fast and nippy, yet still capable of overrunning the occasional strongpoint, like the Hellhound, or you'll want something capable of engaging the enemy over long distances in case of a large-scale enemy counterattack, like, for example, the Lehman Russ Vanquisher. However, the Hellhound would in all due likelihood be too lightly armoured to be much help in the main bashing their heads in against the defences part, and the Vanquisher's high-velocity cannon doesn't carry anywhere near as much good old-fashioned HE as the big fat low-velocity cannon of the Demolisher, and is so going to be way less useful against bunker lines. And whilst of course the Imperial Guard is justly famed for being a very large hammer, and therefore turning every problem into a nail, the Krieg Regiment, despite their somewhat blunt approach to problem solving, are not above employing a little bit of finesse here and there, since all of their officers have made their ways up from the bottom ranks. They are experienced and, before all, expedient commanders. If a problem can be solved quicker and easier via the utilization of the correct tool, and said tool happens to be in their toolbox, they are more than happy to use it as well. And speaking of the toolbox, let's have a look at the size of this one in particular. We do not know exactly what types of vehicles or what numbers they were in, but we do know the rough size of the company. Being equally engorged as its infantry equivalent, it would contain some 1,000 vehicles, and they would in turn be crewed by 4,000 to 6,000 men, taking into account variations in numbers of crews, with the standard Lehman Russ having 4, but occasionally also having 6 with 2 sponson-mounted heavy weapons. But of course, tanks alone are hardly going to be enough, and considering the defensive lines on Vraks could be many kilometers deep, simply just rushing through with armor and hoping for the best was not a valid option. So we are going to be needing some infantry. That's where the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Company comes in, with the 2nd Company being worthy of particular notice, since it was equipped with Gorgon heavy assault transports. And to give you an idea of exactly why that is so important, let me first introduce you to the Centaur, Universal Carrier, shown here with a rough size comparison to a Guardsman. The Centaur is a light vehicle used for all manners of things. It transports ammunition, men, officers, the wounded, general equipment, and can even tow light artillery pieces. It is the workhorse of the 88th Siege Army, but it's not very big. Nor is it very well armed or armoured. It can carry a half a squad of 5 or 6 men with decent speed and mobility, more than enough to keep up with the tanks, although it's going to be offering very little in the way of protection while doing so. It is not at all suited for attacking heavily fortified positions, as even a heavy machine gun could quite easily defeat its frontal armour. Thusly, the men of Krieg need something a bit heavier to transport them to the enemy lines. That is where the Gorgon comes in, and this is a pretty good approximate size comparison. The Gorgon Heavy Assault Transport is designed to carry 5 full squads, 50 men, straight up to the front of an enemy bunker, then hose it down with its array of secondary and primary weaponry before disgorging its complement of infantry. A Gorgon comes standard with 2 twin sets of heavy stubbers for a total of 4 heavy machine guns and 4 heavy sponson-mounted weaponry. These could be mortars, heavy flamers, or heavy bolters. But its primary function, the delivery of vast quantities of infantry, is facilitated by its main feature, its forward assault ramp. This not only eases the deembarkation of the infantry mounted on the Gorgon, it also acts as an additional meter of shock-absorbent frontal plating, being able to move independently from the Gorgon's primary chassis. It is able to stop practically anything, at the very least once, and should be able to weather the worst that any defensive line can throw at it. It is also designed to be easily removed and replaced with a fresh assault ramp, since, as you can probably imagine, it does tend to take a fair bit of a beating. And the 2nd Company, consisting of some 20,000 grenadiers, would have 400 of these monstrosities, enough to carry the entire company into battle. This means that these heavy companies would undoubtedly be the premier assault troops in the entire 88th Siege Army, whilst the 3rd and 4th Company were primarily mechanized formations designed to support the tanks, primarily equipped with centaurs and the occasional chimera, although both companies also possessed 100 Gorgons for additional heavy assault support. Additionally, the Gorgons of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Company were often detached from their parent formations when they didn't have anything in particular to do, and were seconded to other formations to act either as the lead forces of an assault, or more usually, as the finishers. Once the first infantry assaults had discovered weaknesses in the enemy's front lines, specialized troops, assigned to the regiment in question, would then board the borrowed Gorgons and use them to approach the weak points in the enemy's front line and break them wide open. Then, finally, we have the 5th Company, which was the primary regimental reconnaissance company, consisting of Death Riders and light scout vehicles, including Salamanders and Chimera scout tanks. Depending on the makeup of the company, be it primarily made up of Death Riders or light vehicles, could considerably impact the size of the formation, but generally speaking it would be around about 20,000 men, the same as a usual specialist company. How many Death Riders and how many light armoured formations was primarily up to the regimental commander himself and his personal preference. Now, you might think that utilizing light armour would automatically be better than cavalry, but let's just say that the Death Riders of Krieg are nothing like regular cavalry, and many of a Krieg commander has grown rather fond of their mobility, and also the sheer punch they can deliver if they can make it to the enemy in one piece. And then finally we can summarize the total size of the 7th Krieg Tank Regiment, though we also need to factor in the crew manning the various forms of transportation within it. Now, the Gorgons are a little tricky because they can be crewed by as few as 3 men or as many as 7 men, but for the purpose of this video we are going to be assuming the largest crew size of 7. Then we have the various mechanized transports in the 3rd and 4th Company. All in all, we're looking at something along the lines of 11,000 men, giving us a total, including the fighting personnel, of 97,000. And now that we know the size of the infantry siege regiments and the tank regiments, the only thing left is the artillery regiment, of which there were 6 divided between 2 bombardment corps. The 19th and the 21st, consisting respectively of the 3rd, 4th and 8th Siege Artillery Regiment and the 19th, 22nd and 23rd Siege Artillery Regiment. And just like the tank and infantry formations, the artillery was equally, if not even more so, engorged, and consisted primarily of heavy guns. The light artillery was supposed to reside within the infantry siege regiment and in the tank support. The bombardment corps, meanwhile, was supposed to bring the heavy guns, the bunker busters, the line destroyers, the hammer with which the Vraksian defenses would be smashed. And they sure were mighty big hammers indeed. For this example, let's have a look at the 19th Siege Artillery Regiment, since in this case all of the regiments were once again of a uniform size and organization. And as usual, we start of course with the regimental headquarters. Artillery regiments tend to be fairly officer-heavy, as they will require large numbers of command personnel to direct the various guns, and perhaps far more importantly, make sure that the guns are fed. An entire siege artillery regiment firing away, possibly for days at a time, devours astronomical quantities of shells, and organizing the continued delivery of this vast amount of ammunition is quite the task in and of itself. Thusly, regimental headquarters has a considerable command staff beneath it, consisting of watchmasters, quartermasters, and also a wide array of specialist personnel. We're talking engineers, surveyors, map makers, artillery experts, maintenance chiefs, logistical officers, radio operators, wiremen, etc., and in addition to that, a considerably sized guard force. And just to be clear, when I say Guard Force, I do not mean Imperial Guard, I mean Guard Force, in the most literal sense, seeing as the artillery regiments will build up massive stockpiles of ammunition, the kind of thing the enemy would be very fond of infiltrating and detonating, if at all possible. Due to the somewhat disastrous consequences of that happening, the ammunition dumps were quite literally the most important locations in the entire army, and as such were heavily guarded with dedicated troops. Of course, the various regiments had their own de facto military police, as well as overall army forces in the form of the watchmasters and their staff, but in the case of the artillery parks, considerably more in the way of manpower and expertise was needed. And speaking of expertise, as mentioned, the artillery regiment was particularly top-heavy, and the considerable guard forces required was run and organized by a sizable detachment of watchmasters, all with their own private staff and enforcement officers. And then of course there are the quartermasters, a chapter all of their very own. The Siege Artillery Regiment employs dozens of quartermasters, each with his own considerable staff of adepts, clerks, and tallymen, who in turn often have their own personal staffs to boot. The quartermasters and their various staffers and sub-staffers alone would number in the thousands, which may seem excessive, but trust me, it is eminently necessary. A single artillery regiment firing full force can eat through hundreds of thousands of shells every hour, and these barrages can go on for days. It is beyond a Herculean task to keep track of just the ammunition requirements alone, and that's before we get into all of the other things the quartermasters need to replenish: men, guns, food, boots, fuel, uniforms, and the huge selection of replacement and spare parts required not only for the guns, whom are regularly stressed to the absolute breaking point, but also the hundreds of vehicles needed to transport it all. It is at least a small mercy that the Administratum Labor Corps and the Mechanicus take care of the transportation from the freshly built spaceport to the rear lines, but even then, millions of tons of supplies need moving, storing, allocating, and replenishing every single day. So having thousands of de facto administrators running around, whilst it might seem strange, the Death Korps never do anything without a reason, and this is most definitively a good reason to have them around. And so, when we add in all of the administrators to all of the guards, the regimental headquarters alone numbers some 10,000 men. A solid half of that is various administrative personnel, like the quartermasters and the watchmasters. And then, of course, we get to what they are actually in charge of supplying with all of these shells. The various companies, or in this case, battery commands. We have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Battery Command, as well as a logistical company within the Siege Artillery Regiment. This logistical company is, however, not purely to move ammunition around. That is, of course, its primary task, but it also contains a considerable number of engineering vehicles to dig the various positions required for the guns, and also to dig out the underground shelters for the temporary storage of their ammunition. But we'll get to that. First, we're going to have a look at the battery commands. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battery commands are essentially identical, whilst the 4th is a wee bit different, but again, we'll get to that as well. First, let us look at the 1st battery command. As previously mentioned, it is expected that the various siege infantry regiments bring their own light supporting artillery, whilst the siege artillery is responsible for bringing the heavy guns. And in this case, we are talking about 2 guns in particular to carry out 2 different tasks. First, we have the long-barreled Earthshaker cannon and the shorter-barreled Medusa siege gun. Let's start with the Earthshaker, the workhorse artillery piece of virtually all Imperial Guard regiments. And not without good reason. The Earthshaker cannon has a good rate of fire, solid accuracy, and perhaps most importantly of all, it is supremely reliable. An Earthshaker cannon is expected to be able to fire for days at a time with only routine maintenance, without any sort of extensive replacement or spare parts. However, this reliability does come at the expense of a somewhat small shell. The Earthshaker cannon, with a 7-man assigned crew, fires a 132mm 38kg shell over 15 kilometers. The range can be increased to 20 to 25 kilometers by increasing the powder charge, a process known as supercharging. However, this will put a considerably larger strain upon the weapon's barrel, and should not be done for more than 20 rounds at a time, and the gun should then not be fired again before the barrel can be thoroughly checked and possibly even replaced. The range can also be increased yet further with the utilization of specialized Adeptus Mechanicus ammunition, which increased the range well in excess of 30 kilometers without putting any further strain upon the gun barrel. However, such ammunition is extremely rare and precious, and is only handed out in small quantities and only used when they absolutely have to. Outside of such extenuating circumstances, the primary role of the Earthshaker cannon is to deliver vast quantities of ammunition during extended artillery barrages. This, of course, has a wide variety of potential applications, but on Vraks, the primary role for the Earthshakers was to deliver something known as a box barrage. The idea behind such a barrage is rather simple, but pulling it off effectively can be quite difficult, so let's have a quick look at it, just so you understand the concept. So, as mentioned, at the basic level it is fairly simple. If you're attacking an enemy position, you want to make sure that you can attack and overwhelm said position. A complication that might make this considerably more difficult is if the enemy starts pouring reinforcements into said position. Since now you're going to have to fight against what is potentially a limitless amount of enemies to capture said position, And since you are on the offensive, that in all due likelihood means that the enemy, being on the defensive, has all kinds of advantages, meaning that you really don't want a drawn-out extended fight. You want to overrun the position as swiftly as possible, and preferably move on from said position also as swiftly as possible. The box barrage is designed to help achieve this objective, and it does so by attempting to cut off the point in question from enemy reinforcements by placing, quite literally, a box of fire around it, pulverizing the nearby area and making any movement of reinforcements too risky to be worth it. As you can see, it's a very simple idea, but it is incredibly difficult to actually pull off, as it will require hundreds of artillery pieces firing in precise coordination with exact coordinates for an extended period of time. On the other hand, the potential benefits, if done correctly, could be considerable, since gaining a foothold within the enemy's lines would be the decisive factor in finally breaking through said line. But of course, it would be much easier to break through the line if the line simply isn't there anymore. And that's where the second gun comes in, the Medusa siege gun. The Medusa is a heavy howitzer, or a bombard. In this case, bombard is a general catch-all term for the heavy siege guns of the 88th Krieg Siege Army. Generally speaking, we are talking about a 305mm howitzer with an effective range of 10 to 12 kilometers, firing a light HE shell of some 280 kilograms or a heavy 400 kilograms delayed fused bunker buster. It is also capable of firing a special Adeptus Mechanicus burrowing shell. This shell utilizes ancient technology to literally bore its way into the ground after impacting, and can thusly burrow itself dozens of meters straight into underground bunkers, dugouts, or ammunition depots. However, this ammunition is also very rare, even more rare than the AdMech shells for the Earthshakers, and thusly are only used if they absolutely have to knock out a particular position, or if they're lucky enough to figure out the location of an enemy ammunition dump. But in reality, this kind of precision strike is not what the Medusa siege gun was designed for. It is designed to be employed in large numbers to simply pulverize enemy defenses. The first shell might not destroy a bunker. The second shell might not destroy a bunker, nor may the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth, the ninth, or the 10th. But number 11, it might do the job. And if it doesn't, number 20 might, or 30, or 40, and so on, and so on, and so on. Even the sturdiest of bunkers will eventually crack under a sustained bombardment from these heavy howitzers. The downside is their relatively slow rate of fire, especially compared to the Earthshaker cannon. This is due to the simple fact that a massive gun requires an equally massive shell, and said massive shell requires specialized lifting equipment to reload the weapon. Additionally, lobbing a 400 kilogram shell over 10 kilometers requires a rather mighty drive charge, which is not at all gentle upon the barrel, meaning that the Medusas require frequent and meticulous maintenance. But fortunately, the Imperial Guard, and Krieg in particular, have figured out a solution to the rate of fire problem. The solution is simply to have a metric ass-ton of guns. Because if a weapon only fires once every 10 minutes, all you need to do to have it fire every minute is to have 10 guns. And that was precisely the kind of solution that the Death Korps had in mind for Vraks. So, let us return to the 19th Siege Artillery Regiment. As mentioned, there were 3 primary batteries, each made up of several sub-batteries made up either of Earthshakers or Bombards. There were a couple of other extremely specialized batteries as well, but frankly their numbers were so few and so specialized in nature that they're not really worth mentioning here. as the overwhelming majority of the guns would be Earthshakers or Bombards, because they were the two types of artillery that they primarily needed. One to block off enemy reinforcements and to pound the living shit out of anything that dared move across no man's land, and one to smash fortifications. All in all, a battery command would be made up of 2,160 guns and 16,000 men. Within this formation, the average battery size was around 10 guns, although this was highly malleable. For example, let's say that they needed to destroy a particularly heavily fortified bunker complex. In that case, a large number of bombards could be gathered together as a single grand battery. These formations would subsequently be seconded to other formations, be it infantry or tanks for example, and used to fulfill a specific task. Or, potentially, they could also be seconded to a particular objective, as in the case of the destruction of the bunker complex. The second and third battery commands would also be the same size as the first battery command, 2,160 guns and 16,000 men. But this is where it gets a little bit different, because Battery C was not an artillery battery. This was a AAA and support battery, though considerably smaller than it would normally be. In this case, around about 1,000 pieces of variant types of AAA and 8,000 men. This also included a fair bit of support equipment like engineering vehicles. This was due to the fact that they did not expect any serious amount of aerial resistance on Vraks. No Imperial Navy aeronautica forces were stationed on the planet once it turned, and Vraks was not known to have any PDF aeronautica forces, meaning that a large contingent of anti-aircraft was simply not necessary. But Krieg does not like doing anything halfway, so they added in a demi-battery command of AAA and some additional engineering and support vehicles. Worst case scenario, the engineering vehicles would certainly be useful, and many of the AAA batteries, like for example the Hydra flak battery with its quad autocannons, could easily be turned upon enemy defenses, and whilst of course 4 autocannons, significant amount of firepower as that might be, would never bust a bunker open, it sure as hell would make damn sure that the occupants of said bunker kept their heads well and truly to the ground. And then finally, the fifth company, the logistical company. Perhaps one of the most important companies in the entire artillery regiment, because regardless of how many guns the regiment might have, if they don't get any ammunition, they're fairly useless after all. And thusly, the logistical company is also the single largest company in the 19th Siege Artillery Regiment, with a full 20,000 men, most of them operating Trojans and Centaur carriers, carrying ammunition to and from the various depots, along with engineering vehicles, and of course armoured recovery vehicles and artillery tractors. Every single gun already has a artillery tractor assigned to it as a part of its 7-man assigned crew, but well, let's just say that lightly armoured artillery tractors have a somewhat short life expectancy on the front line, considering how often the massed batteries of Krieg draw the attentions of enemy massed batteries. Having a couple dozen replacements here and there would not go amiss. The logistical company is also one of fairly few formations in the entire 88th Siege Army that are very rarely seconded to any other formations, purely because they're usually kept so very busy that there's really no real leeway to second them to anybody but their assigned regiment. So then, all in all, this leaves us with the 19th Siege Artillery Regiment with a total of 76,000 men and 7,480 guns total, including the AAA. So then, now that we know the size of the individual regiments, let's have a look at the 88th Siege Army in all its glory. First and foremost, the Line Corps. The 4 Line Corps, the 1st, 5th, 30th, and 34th, would number some 2 million men. The Assault Corps, the 8th and the 11th, with the 11th being slightly smaller than the 8th, would number some 887,000 men. The two bombardment corps, the 19th and the 21st, would number 304,000 men. And finally, we would have the independent artillery companies, adding yet another 224,000 men and some 30,240 additional guns. This gives us a total size of 3.4 million men. And to put that yet further into perspective, these 3.4 million men were attacking an area roughly the size of the county of Northumberland in England. Not a very big area. Of course, they landed a significant distance away from the main fortifications of Vraks, so the total battlefield would be a fair bit larger, but the area in which they were attacking was around about 5,000 square kilometers, which is not a lot of ground for this many troops. And of course, these are just the fighting men. If we add in the various support staffs, the Administratum Labor Corps, the Adeptus Mechanicus contingents for running the large trains and organizing the supply yards, etc., we're probably looking at something along the lines of 4 to 5 million, but who cares about the non-combatants anyway? Not like they're going to be the stars of the show, now are they? So, now you've got a good idea of just how large the 88th Siege Army is. The question then is, how well will this force fare against the defenders of Vraks? To find that out, you'll have to keep watching the series, won't you? Until next time, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.